So what happens to a person's faith when they move to a brand new country? We're about to dive into that very question. And let me tell you, the answer reveals something really profound about belief, culture, and identity.
It seems like a pretty straightforward question, doesn't it? I mean, you'd think if you move to a place where religion just isn't as big a deal in public life, then over time your family's connection to that faith would probably weaken. It's a really common assumption.
But as the research shows, the reality is way more complicated. The journey of faith across different immigrant generations can follow some very, very different and honestly, pretty surprising paths. Okay, so first, let's set the stage here. The whole premise is that Western societies, Europe, North America, are becoming more secular. We're talking about places where up to 60% of the population now says they're non-religious. This is the world many immigrants are stepping into. And right away, that creates this huge contrast. See, most immigrants are coming from countries where religion is a much more central part of everyday life. So they're starting from a place of, on average, higher religiosity than the people in their new home.
Now there's an academic term for this expected trend. It's called secularization. And the theory is pretty simple. As immigrants and their kids start to integrate into a less religious society, you'd expect them to adopt the majority's values, and their own religious feelings would just naturally fade.
So the big question is, does the data actually back this theory up? Well, for a lot of immigrant groups, the answer is a clear yes. You can see a very distinct pattern of faith fading from one generation to the next.
Okay, take a look at this table. It breaks down what's called the religion loss rate, basically the percentage of people who leave the faith they grew up in. And just look at the trend for Christians. For the first generation, only about 8% leave. But by the second generation, that number just explodes to 28%. And we see a similar thing happening with Buddhists.
This chart really makes it easy to see, especially for Christian immigrants. The first generation that arrives, they stay highly religious. But their kids, the second generation, who are born and raised in this new country, they become way more secular. They start looking a lot more like the rest of the native-born population.
So, what's behind all this? Well, the research points to a few key things. The second generation is just more likely to marry someone who's less religious. They're growing up in secular schools, they have secular friends, they're basically integrating into the cultural mainstream, and that includes its more secular values. But just when the pattern seems totally clear, the data throws us a real curveball. Because there's one major group that doesn't follow this path at all.
Yeah, for Muslim immigrants in the West, this whole theory of secularization just kind of stops working. That expected fading of faith, it just doesn't happen.
And this slide really puts it in black and white. On the left, you've got that clear drop for second-generation Christians. But look at the right. Second-generation Muslims stayed just as religious as their parents. Some studies even find their faith gets stronger. And the data on this is incredibly consistent. On a 10-point scale of how religious someone is, both the first and second generation of Muslim immigrants score an identical 7.6. There is zero drop-off. This isn't just a little blip in the trend. This is a totally different thing happening.
So this leads us to the absolute core puzzle of this whole analysis. Why? Why does this one group diverge so sharply from what we'd expect? What is it that makes their connection to faith so incredibly resilient from one generation to the next?
The research proposes a really powerful explanation for this. It argues that it's not just about faith as a set of beliefs. It's about faith becoming a source of identity. So, the key concept here is this idea of an identity marker. This is when a part of you, in this case your religion, becomes more than just a personal belief. It becomes the main way you define yourself and how you distinguish your group from the society around you.
This quote from the source material just nails it. For the children of immigrants growing up as a minority, Islam isn't just about prayer and scripture. It's about who they are in a society where they might feel different.
A great way to understand this is to think of a place like Northern Ireland. For a long time, saying you were Catholic or Protestant wasn't just about your theology. It was about your community, your history, your entire group. Religion became an identity marker. And a similar dynamic seems to be playing out here. And there are a few social factors that really reinforce this whole process. Muslim communities, for example, tend to have lower rates of marriage outside the faith. The research also shows they might have fewer close friendships with natives. And, this is crucial, experiences of discrimination can act like a kind of glue, making that sense of a shared, separate identity even stronger.
But this story has another layer to it, because it turns out where you live matters a lot. This dynamic plays out very differently in Europe compared to the United States.
Think about it. In Europe, which is super secular, if you're a devoutly religious person, you really stand out. That high religiosity becomes a very obvious marker of difference. But in the United States, which is a more religious country to begin with, that same level of devotion doesn't seem as distinct. It just blends in more.
So ultimately, it's the contrast that's the key thing. In the U.S., the religious gap isn't that big. Muslim immigrants are about as devout as American Christians. But in Europe, that gap can be a chasm. They are far, far more religious than the average European. And that huge difference completely changes how religion works as an identity.
So what's the big takeaway from all of this? Well, it's that the story of immigrant faith is not some simple, one-way street to becoming less religious. For some groups, under certain circumstances, the pressure of being a minority in a new country doesn't weaken their faith. It actually transforms it into a core pillar of who they are.
And that leaves us with a final, really important question to think about. In our world that's only becoming more diverse and in many places more secular, what does it mean for our future when, for millions of people, faith isn't just about what you believe, but it's fundamentally who you are?